welcome one and all to this latest instalment of the Road to 2015 series that we have, and we always like to bring events, personalities, personage of the highest quality, and I'm sure you'll agree that our guest of honour tonight, Rafael Behr, the new Statesman, Oliver Letwin, who I think counts as one of our honorary founding fathers, certainly presides and attends our events beneficently over many years and contributed mightily to our proceedings. So welcome both of you. In conversation is, as I said to our guest of honour earlier, is meant to lull our visitors into a false sense of security. I know that with Rafael's masterly tradecraft, he will bait and provoke with with intent of eliciting hopefully the most controversial possible answers. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you. Well, actually, what I said when we were preparing for this is that I'll do the falsehood and Oliver can do the security, but that's the hazard of the journalistic trade. The format for these events, I'm sure you're familiar with, and I like to keep it very informal, not least because formality doesn't really become me. We'll talk. I'll ask Oliver some questions. I'm obviously deeply grateful to be invited to do this and very flattered that Oliver has agreed. He doesn't need any introduction. You're obviously all here. When you're fed up of hearing my voice, I will feel the pent-up questioning rising from the audience so eagerly that I will then go over to you and we'll take questions and it will proceed like that until 7:30. So let's just get straight into it. The manifesto for the last general election, this was billed as the road to 2015, the road to the manifesto, was, as I remember it, the invitation to join the government of Great Britain. It turns out not everyone took up that invitation. There were some RSVPs didn't come through. The ambition was obviously to have a bold, ambitious, radical, reforming Conservative government. You found yourselves with a coalition government that had some ambitious, radical, reforming elements and some other elements as well. You're looking at governing, ideally, in a majority after 2015. I'm wondering if you could start by just telling us a little bit about what you'll be offering the country then, as a model for the state. We were in policy exchange, everyone was talking about public sector reform. For the state after 2015, is it going to be dramatically different from the one we've got now, or is it just going to be smaller?
Well, I think you need to start back with some understanding of where we were in 2010 and where we are now, and that explains a great deal about where we want to go. The country in 2010, I think, by almost anybody's reckoning, faced some very, very serious problems. Obviously, above all, an enormous deficit and a very serious, or what turns out to have been the most serious recession since the Great Depression. The principal effort, therefore, of this government, and it would have been the principal effort of the Conservative government had we had a majority government, for that purpose doesn't really make any difference, has been to put that situation right by forging and then sticking like glue, often through some pretty strong criticism and skepticism, by a long-term economic plan. And that's obviously involved a whole series of different things, some of which have to do with reducing the deficit. Some of them have to do with changing the public sector so that it could get more for less, so we could actually continue to provide the same or better public services with reduced expenditures, except in the health services, one that we were able to keep up and increase in real terms slightly, but which of course has also suffered from very significant pressure of increasing demand. So everywhere across the public services there's been a great deal of strain, and we've devoted therefore a huge amount of attention not just to reducing deficit, but to doing it in ways that have meant that we've been able to make the public services as good or better. And there's also been alongside all of that, and as an enormous important component of it all, a very considerable drive to find ways of enabling individuals and communities to take over more of the power over the way that they live their lives. And that was, of course, one of the main thrusts of the manifesto that you referred to, with its emphasis on the big society. Therefore, what's happened during the past 4 years, and will have happened during the past 5 by the time we get to the election, is very much what you might have expected to happen if you had sat down and read our manifesto for the last election. It's no coincidence, because there was a quite considerable similarity between our programme then and the Liberal programme, and therefore when we came to put together the programme for government, what emerged was very similar to our manifesto. Now, that long-term economic plan, with all the other aspects that I've described, while I would argue it's been quite considerably successful in turning the country round, we make no secret of the fact that it has by no means completed yet. There's a great deal of work to do, and therefore I think what you can anticipate in the next Parliament is an effort to complete it.
Specific things in that, because the health service is a very interesting one, isn't it? Because, as you say, the pressure, or the budget pressure, just from demographic changes, from the cost of medicines, from inflation in the health sector, is just going to carry on growing. There has been the commitment to ring-fence spending, despite the fiscal pressures that are going to be ongoing in the next Parliament. Perhaps you could, first of all, clarify for us whether that will still be a commitment in 2015 for the next Parliament, but also whether you feel that perhaps some of the structural changes that you might like to introduce to the health service to manage those cost pressures are going to be difficult for the Conservatives, because you kind of squandered your political capital on reform in this Parliament.
Oh, no, I don't agree with that at all.
You just start with the point about the ring-fencing spending, though, just so we...
Well, I can start with it, but I can only tell you that neither on this nor any other point you asked me about can I tell you what will be in the next manifesto. We haven't written it yet. No, I don't agree with you at all about the health service. The steps that we've taken to improve the health service and to deal with this very, very great pressure, which I think everybody accepts, are, I think, both fundamental and right, and I suspect, actually, increasingly are a matter of consensus across British politics. So, for example, we have taken steps to take a really quite large sum of money and devote it to improving the ability of adult social services, adult services, to keep frail and elderly people out of having to go into hospitals, which is horrible for them and very expensive for the taxpayer. I think there's a great deal of consensus that that's something that one needs to do, but it's by no means complete yet. There's a great deal of work to do yet to improve the chances of frail and elderly people being able to remain healthy and at home. The creation of named GPs that are specifically responsible for them, another element of the same sort of plan. We've also engaged in a whole series of actions to try to enable the health service to devote much more of the very large sum of money that's spent on it to curing patients and not to administering. I think we've reduced by 15,000 or something.
In terms of the position that the Conservative Party will bring to an election then, is it going to be, with regard to the health service, sort of reassurance and consolidation, which was what was really the message in 2010, or more further revolution? Because it's going to be quite difficult to do both, and the polls do show that Conservatives simply still aren't trusted enough to run the health service.
I don't think that there's been revolution. There has been evolution, and I see every reason to continue that evolution. If you look at what we've been doing in public health, for the first time we have identified and ring-fenced the budget for public health so that it doesn't get raided when the rest of the system is under pressure, as it has been. And we've invested heavily in drug and alcohol rehabilitation within that, and a whole series of public health measures, again, to keep people healthy so that they don't create the pressure on the system later and indeed live happier and healthier lives. And I think all the evidence is that that's beginning to work, but again, there's much to be done. One of the reasons that crime has been falling is that for the first time in many, many years, the number of people who are dependent on opiates and a cocktail of other drugs, very problematic, chaotic drug use, has actually been falling, because the numbers we've been lifting out of that condition slightly exceed, only slightly, but it's a great achievement, the numbers falling into it. So for the first time, you're seeing a reduction. And just yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was sitting around with a whole group of people from various local authorities and CCGs who come together to try to make sure that we do effectively lift people out of those conditions. So if you're asking, is the job done? No. Have we been doing the sorts of things you need to do to make the health service over the next 5, 10, 15 years sustainable? And indeed, while we're at it, to reduce the costs to society and to the taxpayer of crime and worklessness and so on, I would say we have been doing those things, and we will need to continue doing more of them.
Now, you mentioned your happy and fruitful partnership with the Liberal Democrats, which continues up until May of next year. Again, thinking about the manifesto, one of the things that is almost certainly going to happen over the next year is people like me, but not just journalists, will start to discuss the Conservative and the Labour manifestos as if they were sort of two-tier operations, that because at some stage as they're going to go, something's going to be up for negotiation. You'll have your sort of front-page policies which will have red lines around them, and then, well, there's bound to be a bit of bartering over the other stuff. Do you anticipate that process happening?
No, because
I sometimes suspect
you go into a general election trying to have the government that you want to be. And the government we want to be is a Conservative government, not another coalition government. And so the stall we will set out will be a stall for a Conservative government.
But you were involved, even before, as I understand it, from reading Matthew Dancona's brilliant book, in ultimately thinking about what a coalition would look like before the general election of 2010, as it became clear that the numbers were tricky for getting a Conservative majority. And I'm afraid this doesn't just apply to the Conservatives, it applies to everyone. No one is going to believe that those calculations and those thoughts aren't going on behind the scenes, that ultimately there isn't a sort of a Venn diagram that says where does our policy overlap with Liberal Democrat policy. So how, could you imagine happily working with the Lib Dems again after 2015?
Well, it's entirely up to you what you choose to believe or don't believe. We live in a free society, and even totalitarian states find some difficulty getting people to believe things they don't believe. But I'm telling you that we're constructing a manifesto and an election campaign and a program for government on the basis of a Conservative government. That's what we're going to try and achieve. And there isn't any other way to do it if you think about it. I mean, if you're asking me the question, have we managed to maintain sensible, courteous, friendly relationships with coalition partners, my answer to you is abundantly yes. I'm led to believe that relationships inside the last single-party government were a great deal more vexed than those between us today. And I spend, half my life talking to Danny Alexander and David Laws about issues that arise, and there's no secret that we disagree about some things, but we have workmanlike and sensible ways of dealing with them. And that's been, as you say, a happy and fruitful process for the country. It's been a huge advantage at a time of crisis. We led it out of that crisis, partly because we have been able to have a workmanlike government. But I would like to have the opportunity to govern as a Conservative party. That's what we're trying to do.
Okay, well, before we take some questions, we're on the eve, obviously, of European elections and local elections, but I want to ask about Europe because those are the elections that seem to be attracting the most excitement. How the current position that the Prime Minister has, as I understand it, is rather pro-European when you look at it, to the extent that he anticipates getting a fantastic deal renegotiate it with Brussels that means that the constitutional settlement is so pleasing to Britain that he will confidently be able to turn to the public and call for an in vote. How much more detail needs to come out about what that settlement looks like between now and May 2015?
Oh, you don't go into a negotiation like that laying out all sorts of detailed things. You go in to try to achieve the best things you can in a sensible and flexible way. We've made it very clear, though, that there are some things that we very much want to see. We want to see much greater control over people moving around to collect benefits in different parts of the European Union. We want not to see the idea of Britain having to be part of an ever closer union. It's a very important structural shift. We want to make sure that control over justice and home affairs is essentially lies with the nation states. So there are a series of things that we've said we want to achieve in very general terms, and of course we are already engaged, have been engaged for the last few years in a series of discussions which give you a very considerable idea of where we're trying to get to. We have managed to keep out of the bailout mechanism, we've kept out of the Eurozone. We have started the process of negotiating about moves towards some deregulation. I think for just one case we've actually managed to get even an exemption for small businesses from a regulation, which may sound like a small achievement, but in Euro terms it's a very great one. And we're beginning to get some traction on the need for Europe to take seriously the study which we, in this country, actually under the previous government and the current one, have developed enormously of studying the impact on business of regulations, actually bring home to people in Europe that you can't just go on regulating.
Those are things that there's quite a broad consensus on that more competitiveness, deregulation, or for help business flourish. It's not hard to find people across the European Union who will agree that those
I agree.
things are doing.
I think there are plenty of allies.
What appears to have happened in this country, though, is that the debate has focused in on the question of free movement and has conflated now with a much thornier immigration debate. And the question you're going to have to start, all politicians are going to have to start answering is, how meaningful is it to have a coherent policy on immigration when all you're doing is fiddling around the margins of non-EU migration, because a vast chunk of it you've surrendered control?
Oh no, we haven't been fiddling around the margins at all. There's enormous importance attached to making sure that we have a controlled system of immigration from outside the EU. It's perhaps indelicate to remind you, given your origins and current occupation, that in the previous administration there was a very, very great deal of difficulty because that system was not under control. It's now been brought under some considerable control.
So I'm intrigued by my origins in that context.
From the New Statesman.
Oh, I see. Well, I just sort of come from a plane from Romania.
No. I don't know where the New Statesman office is, but I guarantee it's in London. No. But I mean, the New Statesman is rather aligned with the previous government. And that government had some very considerable difficulty with immigration from, control of immigration from outside the EU. We have not had such difficulty with that. And that's because Theresa May has taken some very, very considerable steps to keep it under control. Rightly. Incidentally, while continuing to admit and indeed encourage those who can contribute to Britain and who are coming here to study and so on. So, I mean, it's been a very carefully judged policy and one which is enormously important that we maintain. So I don't at all accept the proposition that we should somehow ignore or forget about that. It's very, very important.
But you don't accept also that there is a tension between ultimately trying to address the concerns of people who have decided, a lot of people who used to vote Conservative, by the way, that free movement of labour, as it currently configured as membership of the European Union, means a lack of control over migration policy that is unacceptable, whereas there are perfectly good liberal economic arguments for having relatively open borders to skilled migration, whether in or without of the EU. And it seems to be very difficult for anyone in politics currently to be making the latter part of that argument, because the former part is what gets all the attention.
We're free traders, and we believe in free trade of goods and services, and we see the advantages of open labour markets, of course. But what we don't want to see is people engaged in coming from one country to another simply in order to collect benefits which the taxpayers of the second country, in our case of our taxpayers, are meeting the costs of. Similarly, it seems very reasonable that we should try to get ourselves in a position where if somebody's coming to use our health service from another European country, the rules should actually be enforced, which they haven't been up till now, so that we recoup from their health service the cost of treatment. So there is a whole series of practical steps to take. But no, we see every advantage in people who can contribute and work, being in this country and contributing and working.
Now, I can't actually remember. Are you one of those senior figures in the Conservative Party who, if there were a referendum on EU membership terms where the status quo is what was on the table, would be in or out? Can you remind me?
It won't be the status quo. What we will be achieving is a renegotiated settlement, which I'm extremely confident, and indeed I hope to be allowed to play some part in this. I'm extremely confident will deliver an arrangement of things that I can absolutely confidently back.
That was a very elaborate non-answering of a hypothetical question, which is always the best thing to do with them, as well you know. Right, let's have some questions. All right, well, we'll take them in batches of 3, but we'll have to take them in batches of 1 at the moment, but that's okay. Oh, there you go, 2. There you go. Oh, 3, look at that. Right, let's see. Didn't take much provocation.
Jeremy Thomas, Interested Spectator. Taking up your remarks on coalition government, how far as economic, whilst every major party in Britain and in other countries would hope to govern either on its own or more on its own, to deliver more of the programme it had promised to the voters. How far does the atomization of society and of political loyalties, which has come about both here and in other European countries, consequent upon economic liberalisation, increase the probability that coalition government may be forced upon major parties anyway?
Thank you. Yes.
Naomi Harris from Bellenden, we're a public affairs consultancy. I was just interested to know how the pledge back in 2010 to be the greenest government ever fits with the most recent pledge to cap onshore wind if elected in 2015, and how that fits with the Climate Change Committee's assurance that onshore wind needs to play a role beyond 2020 for security of supply, affordability of supply and sustainability of supply, and the increasing popularity of onshore wind, according to DEC's most recent statistics.
Increasing popularity in certain constituencies. I know there's this gentleman here.
Hello, Minister. My question's a bit more practical. I'm just more interested in...
Did you say who you are?
Sorry, Dan Regan from Cicero Group. My question is, who exactly is going to be playing a part in contributing to the Conservative Manifesto? Is this going to be a sort of number 10 operation using the policy board, or are we going to be more hearing from the ministers from all the departments coming into number 10 and contributing their ideas? So is it going to be more centralised, or is it going to be much more sort of open consultation, learning from the last few years?
And to think you were sceptical earlier about how interested the audience would be in process and put the manifesto together. So thank you very much for that.
I don't know whether you'll be interested in my answer. Let me take it boringly in the order that these were asked. I'm not a theorist. I'm a practicing politician. So maybe there's some professor that can give you a different answer. But I don't personally believe that there's been some sort of fundamental atomization of the kind you describe. I think we're living in very much the same country that we've been living in for some years. And I don't think that the shape of politics is therefore sort of in some sort of fundamental way, as far as I can see, altered. I think it's perfectly possible for the Conservative Party to obtain a working majority in the House of Commons after the next election as a majority government. And we have an electoral system which tends, I mean, all else equal, to produce that result more than proportional representation systems do. And indeed, for those of us who are passionate devotees of that system, and incidentally, I should add in my own defense, were and continue to be passionate devotees of that system at a time when it absolutely was devastating for the Conservative Party through many years of opposition, when we had tiny numbers of members of Parliament because of the system of first past the post constituency. I still believe in it then. And the reason I believe in it is that it has the good effect that in general, not always, as we've seen in the last few years, but in general, it produces a majority government. That majority government is then judged by the population at the end of its time of office, and if they like it, or anyway tolerate it, it continues, and if they don't, they throw it out, somebody else takes over. Whereas if you have a system of proportional representation, you do get the sorts of effects that you were describing, that very typically they will produce all sorts of coalitions that are very typically put together after the election by politicians, which we had to do this time, but is not, in my view, sort of, in general, the best way of running a democracy. I think it's better to have it clear, let the public decide at the end of the period, is this a lot of people we want to let run our country for the next few years? And I think that's what our system will continue to deliver by and large. The question you ask is a useful one because it has a premise in it which I think is very clearly false. I'm a very long-term proponent of the view that well, this is hardly a view, it's sort of, I think now universally accepted, climate change is happening. B, and this is the bit that I accept is more controversial, but I personally believe that it doesn't make any sense for humanity to take the risk that anthropogenic climate change is continuing at a pace which could cause significant difficulties. And therefore, I have believed for a long time, and I continue to believe, it's one of the reasons why I was one of the original propagators of the what became the Climate Change Act, that we in Britain have an important role in continuing to be one of the world's leaders in moving towards a zero-carbon economy. And one of the purposes of that act was indeed to lock that in so that it didn't become something that other parties could throw sticks and stones at you for doing. And I think it works for that reason. Now, I also believe that the right way to achieve that goal is one that is both at the lowest possible cost and at the greatest possible diversity and security of energy, and which is sensitive to other environmental concerns. Because being green doesn't just mean being concerned with carbon. I caused some amusement in some quarters some while back by making a speech about beauty. I actually think that environment doesn't just mean carbon, it doesn't even just mean ecological systems, though ecosystems are incredibly important and we've done a great deal of work on them in this Parliament. It also means actually what the place looks like and feels like, what it's like to live in it, because this is an incredibly important determinant of the quality of life. I mean, I personally feel that, but also any number of sociological surveys will show you that most of our fellow citizens feel that too. So you have to balance these things. You're trying to achieve a carbon objective, but you're trying to achieve it in a way that's as cheap as possible, as secure in energy as possible, and as consistent with other environmental and ecological constraints as possible. The decision that we've got at 13 gigawatts, enough, or will have at 13 gigawatts, enough onshore wind, is a decision which responds. I mean, you may have found some survey that suggests that onshore wind is deeply popular with my constituents, but let me assure you that's not my experience. I have contested a marginal seat the whole of the 17 years I've been in Parliament. It will continue to be marginal. I shall continue to contest it. I pay quite a lot of attention to what my constituents feel, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. And let me assure you that there's a great deal of discontent about landscapes which are not easily suitable for very large onshore wind installations, amongst people who are equally devoted as I am to reducing carbon and the other things I was mentioning. And so at some point or other you say, okay, well, we've got enough of that, and we'll try to find other means of ensuring the combination of zero carbon in the timescales defined by the Act and secure energy supplies and the lowest possible cost. That's what we're doing. And I think that is a definition of what it is to be a sensible but the greenest ever government. And that's precisely what we have been doing. In other words, I'm much more optimistic than you are about the ability to carry out a balancing act here and to carry the population with us. The last thing I'd say about it, because it's an incredibly important issue, is that I think some people who are as devoted to these things as I am have made the mistake of supposing that they don't need to attend to the question of whether they are carrying the public with them. We do need to attend to that. You know, we are living rightly in a democracy, a liberal democracy. We're not in a state where you just ride roughshod over people, and none of us in this room would want to be. And that means that politicians who are trying to achieve a very long-term goal for the country have to carry the people with them. And that means you have to attend to these other concerns and not just sort of monomaniacally go for one thing. Coming to the question of process, which you rightly said, you said before, no one would be interested in, I'm afraid I may not interest you by telling you that, rather sort of boringly and obviously, like every manifesto process I've been involved with for really a very, very large number of years, one way and another, this is one that involves a very large number of people, all contributing in many different ways. We've been running a Conservative Policy Forum, of which I'm the chairman for several years in this Parliament, gathering in ideas. We have the Policy Board and a whole series of groups of colleagues in the House of Commons contributing through those means. We have a series of commissions or committees which are chaired respectively by George Osborne and William Hague and Theresa May and so on, which are bringing together people from the Policy Board, people from our backbench committee, the 1922 committee, ministers and advisors to discuss what's sort of emerging from this. And, you know, unsurprisingly and rather uninterestingly, but I think quite sensibly, all of this process is contributing gradually to the evolution of a programme. And because we started this really long way back and have gradually evolved it, there's a lot of material being generated, and then you start making selections as you go through. But as I say, there's a difference between this time and some other times, because I certainly have been involved in this sort of process at previous times when there was a genuine question of the general direction, even by sort of this stage of a parliament, of the party in terms of its policy. Now, this is absolutely not the case at the moment. I'm trying to avoid sort of engaging in massive partisan commentary, but I think that there is a clear distinction between our position, so to speak, and that of Labour. We came in with a view of what the nature of the problems facing this country were. We've addressed them in a very, you may think it's right or wrong, but we've addressed it in a very consistent way. We think it's succeeding. We think it's not yet a job done. We're very clear that what needs to be done in the next Parliament is to continue that long-term economic plan and bring it to final fruition in a prosperous, stable Britain that can deliver for its people what its people want and deserve. And therefore, there's an enormous continuity of purpose here and a great clarity about the broad lines. Whereas I think the problem the Labour Party has, which is one that I recognise from our past in opposition, is there's not the slightest idea what it wants to do next. And that's an interesting and intellectually exciting position to be in, but it's not necessarily an easy one to be in if you want to form a proper kind of government a year from now. We have the great luck that we know exactly in broad lines where we're going. And so for us, the question is, within that general context, exactly how do you do this or that? You know, if we've built 500,000 new apprenticeships and we want to have more apprenticeships, exactly how do we do that? That's the kind of question we're addressing, which is incredibly important, but it's not at the first level, because the first level of decisions we've made already. We know what our plan is and we're carrying it through.
If I can invite, it's interesting, the most generous interpretation you could probably put on the Labour position at the moment is that, in policy terms, is that they have, that Ed Miliband has developed an interesting analysis of what he thinks is the underlying structural problem with the economy. I don't substantially disagree with you that there is a problem in terms of how that becomes a sort of a retail offer to be the government of the UK in 2015. But just, if I can invite you to be, since you say you will aspire to be non-partisan, to consider what that analysis is, sort of imagine yourself in Ed Miliband's head if you dare, that there are these long-term processes that means the sort of transmission mechanism that means when you have a growing economy, it just isn't trickling down efficiently and effectively anymore. Wages have been suppressed for a long time. Avoiding comparisons between Labour policy and sort of dictatorships of the second half of the 20th century, or North Korea, or East Germany, or anything like that, trying to be as dispassionate as you can. Is that analysis, is that something that the next Conservative government would also have to deal with?
Well, I'll certainly avoid the slurs you described. No, I understand your description of his analysis, but I think it is, at the level of analysis, fundamentally flawed. The problem of this country over the past 6-7 years has not been that there's been splendid growth and it's failed to trickle down. The problem has been that there was a frightful mess, and that the conditions for growth were all but destroyed. We had the conditions in 2010 for major catastrophe if we hadn't started putting it right. Indeed, that was one of the things that gave rise to the coalition being so quickly formed, that we were told by all and sundry that just a few more weeks of Britain not having a government, and who knew what the international financial markets would do to us. So the problem has been that because Mr. Brown, as Chancellor, incidentally, I mean, I don't share the view that he was nearly as bad a Prime Minister as people think, because I think his problems as Prime Minister were due to the fact of his chancellorship. And as Chancellor, and I think he was the worst Chancellor that Britain's had, since we had Chancellors of the Exchequer, which isn't very long, admittedly, but it's quite a long time, because he wildly overspent money which he didn't have, and built in a sort of machine for spending more and more and more, highly ineffectually in many cases, not all, but in many cases. And because he failed to address supply-side problems in the economy, which I don't think he ever understood, we got ourselves... Oh, and then there was a banking crisis, which he didn't wholly invent, although he made a mistake about the regulation of the banks. And then there was an international recession, which was certainly not his fault. So you put together a whole series of things which George rather aptly described as not mending the roof while the sun was shining. The upshot was that people have had to, we have all had, both at national level and individually, to pay back, to make up for the excessive borrowing, which the nation as a whole had done. Now, under those circumstances, what happens is people got poorer. And they were getting poorer already by 2010. And that is, of course, a really serious problem. And the answer to it is what you would expect, which is to try and make them richer again. And that's what we've been trying to do.
It isn't exclusively in Britain that there is a conversation now about the prospect that certainly, just in terms of any government having an adequate degree of democratic legitimacy to take difficult decisions, on the basis of the analysis you've just given, if there is a perception that a small number of people are sort of soaring away at the top in wealth terms. And if you rule out, as I'm sure you would, and many sensible people would, just confiscating money from rich people to hand it out to people who haven't got as much, do you need to look at other mechanisms to address that sense of, what the question we had earlier, that there is a breakdown of solidarity if you have a yawning inequality?
Well, the mechanism that we have chosen to use, to some considerable unpopularity in some quarters, is to to extract a large amount of tax from those who had most. And those who had most have paid most. They've contributed more to getting us out of this deficit than anyone else. Not only absolutely, of course, but as a proportion of their income. And that we think is as it should be. But it hasn't been popular or easy in some quarters, as I say. And you could read any number of newspapers not, I accept the Statesman. But
you'd be surprised.
Others that complain about that. But we've tried to be fair and balanced about it. And part of the reason is because actually that's the only way you could make the numbers add up and people have a tolerable life when people at the bottom of the heap and indeed in the middle have been struggling. But actually the other reason is we think it's fair. And I think that it's sort of recognized as fair, and that means you do carry the whole population with you. And actually, you know, what really amazes me as I look back at the last 4 years is what hasn't happened. You know, I remember talking to audiences of various kinds and being told in 2010, you know, when people could see what the problem was, well, okay, you recommend doing this and this to solve it, but, you know, before you can say Jack Robinson, there'll be general strikes and disaster, and, you know, there hasn't been. Actually, the nation has, roughly speaking, come along with us in trying to do what was necessary. And I think that's because people recognized that we were not doing it because it was something we would like to do or had chosen to do, but because it was necessary to do.
Let's take some more questions. Oh, John T. And although you still have to identify yourself, because I'm not going to do that before you. And then there's a gentleman just over to his left.
John T. Olive Cooper from McKinsey. What are the 2 or 3 policy things that are most worrying to you about the next 3 or 4 years, Oliver?
Well, I'm sure that the things that will most worry us if we find ourselves as the next government are things we can't now predict, because it's precisely the things you didn't predict that you haven't predicted, and so they worry you when they arrive, and you have to work out solutions at the time. The things that most preoccupy me at the moment are things which have to do with carrying through what we've started, but which are very difficult to do. I talked about the health service. I think trying to find a way of making our National Health Service sustainable for the long term at a cost that the taxpayer can bear, delivering the quality of service that its patients rightly demand, is a task requiring huge imagination about how we manage better to engender better public health and a better ability of people to be cared for in innovative ways that are better for them and more affordable.
What's your, and so just on that point, what's your personal feeling about this idea that's around all across the political spectrum of having a hypothecated tax that would at least, the advantage for both sides really of this debate, left and right, is that you put up front the recognition of how much this is really costing people, which, if on the left they say this would legitimise the spending, on the right there's a sense that that would make people realise that more radical reform is needed than they had perhaps anticipated. What's your feeling about that?
I have to say, I think people are pretty aware that the system is inevitably enormously expensive. You know, we're spending, I think it's about £110 billion a year on the National Health Service. And I think, you know, however good or bad individual people are at imagining these very large sums, people can see that it's very, very expensive. I don't think you need to do anything to bring that out particularly. But I do think that the business of trying to work out how to make that number produce the health service we need it to produce when the population is aging in the way it is and when medicine is advancing the way it is a fundamental challenge that the next government, and indeed probably the government after that, will have to face on behalf of this country. The second thing like that is that I think we've made an enormous strides in the last few years, for the first time really in recent British history, towards lifting people out of welfare and into work. But it's only one, but it's one of the reasons why we've created 1.5 million new jobs, which is 3 times as many as we've got rid of or are getting rid of in the public sector, which is why employment has risen, not fallen, despite many of the commentators and indeed some of our opponents saying that was impossible. But there's so much more to do there. I mean, we have begun to make saving pay through the pension reforms and the Dil-Not cap and the way we have begun to raise the basic state pension so that we reduce and eventually mainly eliminate means testing in retirement. We've begun to make work pay by all sorts of things like benefit cap, but the introduction of universal credit, which is a huge step forward, an enormously difficult thing to do and to implement, will be a major challenge for the next government, getting that right, making it happen right, so that we end up with everybody in this country really feeling that it's, first of all, worth working, and secondly, worth saving. That's a very different Britain. It's a very, very big challenge. And as I say, I think we've made enormous strides, but there's a huge amount more to be done. And then the third thing I'd say, which is you know, an almost equal challenge to those colossal challenges, is to complete the work that Michael Gove has been doing in trying to reform our school system so that we actually give people the education they deserve up and down the country, and that goes with a whole series of reforms of apprenticeship and further education and higher education, so that we end up with a system as a whole in which whatever background you start from, wherever you live in the country, you can actually be sure that you are getting a world-class education that is suited to you and your needs and your desires and the way you want, as Michael would put it, to write your own life story. And that has huge economic implications and also huge social implications and huge implications for individuals. And you know, if I had to pick three great challenges outside the field of sort of strict economics that the next government is going to have to face as part of what I describe as our long-term economic plan, it would be that, to get the health service into a shape where it's fully sustainable, delivers what the people want and need at an affordable price, to get people firmly into a situation where saving and working pays forever, and to get our education system to be as good as the best in the world.
Those your top three, John T?
I think I'd go with certainly number one, and probably with the, well, I think on the schools front, I might talk that bit more towards skills, but maybe that was...
Oh, I don't mean to disagree with that, Scott. I see that the two is completely connected. I mean, a university technical college could be described either as a school or as a means of providing people with vocational education. And I don't care which way you describe it.
I'd insert housing in there, but we might come
Oh,
back
well,
to that.
that's a good fourth. Yes. No, listen, incidentally, that's great. If we could all agree that there are 4 or 5 challenges, I think we can address them.
Ben Tansey, Elliot. So we've seen the kind of emergence of politics over a pint, and Nigel and Alex are pretty good at it. Obviously, with the referendum after the next election and the referendum later this year are some way in terms of pacifying them. What other concessions or thoughts do you have towards them, and how that's going to influence the manifesto? And I'd also like to end with, between Nigel and Alex, who would you most like to go for a drink with, and why?
I'm delighted to be able to tell you that I was sitting here as you proceeded with your question, wondering who the hell Nigel and Alex were. And
They're interns at Policy Exchange. They have this real power.
By the end of your question, I sort of got the idea. But I'm certainly not going to answer your last question. I can answer the first one by saying that that's not the way I think about the thing. I mean, we are engaged in the grown-up business of trying to govern the country as well as we know how. And I came into politics to try to do that. You know, I mean, lots of people think one thing or another about anything that I or my colleagues happen to think. But it seems to me you do what it is you think is right. You do it in the best way you can. Of course, from time to time, you make mistakes and you try and put them right. But what you don't do is to work out some sort of fancy algorithm which tells you what you ought to do to deal with something or other that's going on in politics. That's for the electorate to decide. They judge you. And in my experience, actually, they tend to judge you by what you have done if you're in government. And incidentally, as a local MP, they tend to judge you by how you are a local MP too. So once you're the incumbent, your job is to do that job well. And that's what you'll be judged by. Other people, because they're not incumbents, will do whatever they do, and they'll try to persuade people they do your job better than you're doing it. Your only response must be to do it as well as you can, and to try and go on doing it as well as you can. End. I see it very, very simple.
Do you have any more questions? If not, I'm going to probe momentarily on housing. Yes, please.
Thanks. Gareth Morgan from the RSPB. I just wanted to follow up your point about beauty, which I think is quite important, but difficult to talk about at a time when the major preoccupation is macroeconomics and people's personal economic situation. How do we practically get that back onto the agenda in a way that isn't going to expose you to further ridicule?
Well, that's a question I often wrestle with. And my answer is by taking practical steps. What people don't find ridiculous and what they still care about fantastically, and you can tell that from what actually happens locally, I'll come on in a moment to what I mean, is actually what is going on around them. So if you are arranging things so that things that surround them are like they would like them to be, and you know there are new garden cities arising that people actually like living in, or there are neighbourhood plans that are bringing forward sensitive, locally determined kinds of housing that are consistent with the housing around it and that fit into the urban landscape or into the village or wherever it may be. If you actually work away at the practical business of what the Ecosystem Services Task Force or the Natural Capital Committee are working at, you know, how do you actually get sensible things done so that the Somerset levels are not flooded, but at the same time they retain their character and their beauty. And you know, as you do these sorts of things, what happens is that you discover that these things which, forgive me, the journalistic fraternity and the media all think are sort of airy-fairy and, you know, frightfully funny, and nobody would be interested in, actually attract much the largest audiences and participation. Anyway, if you look at neighbourhood, we're now doing 1,000 neighbourhood plans have begun. Incidentally, I was told there would never be a neighbourhood plan in Britain, nobody would be anyway interested. They are completely devoted to it. And the experience of neighbourhood planning is everyone turns up. Hundreds of people come and get together and concern themselves with it because they really care what their place looks like. Incidentally, they begin by believing that it can't possibly really have given them this power. But once they begin slowly to half believe that they actually have the power to determine what their place looks and feels like, they suddenly discover this is fantastically important to them. And everybody starts coming, and then people start talking in an intelligent and interesting and passionate way about what they want their place to be like. So actually, I don't think that even at a time when people have been struggling economically, even when there are all sorts of national and local and family concerns about the economy, actually people go on caring about these things. But you just have to deal with them in a practical way and give people the power to concern themselves in a practical way with those things. And then you unleash a huge amount of passion and intelligence and action.
Housing is a great example in this area, though, isn't it? Because you can obviously see the appeal, in theory, of a situation where the demand for new housing or new development somehow works in harmony with the sort of organic will of the people in whose communities new houses are going to be built or where new garden cities will be built. But the sense of growing political urgency is such that I detect a trend back towards viewing housing as a kind of sort of strategic infrastructure emergency that means that the pressure is on central government to just start mandating. No,
absolutely not. No, we are trying to achieve a radical transformation in which people in Britain, because they feel empowered to determine the shape and character of what is built, actually welcome it. And you know, I'll give you a really striking example from my own constituency. So, in the emerging local plan in my constituency, no additional housing is scheduled for any village. It's all scheduled for the towns. Happens to be the decision that the district council took. It's a very understandable pattern. So the first neighbourhood plan in my constituency, which is just about to finish, it's sort of going through its very last stages, in a village called Cernabis, the villagers could have decided to build nothing because the local plan didn't demand anything. And you are automatically consistent with the National Planning Policy Framework if you're consistent with the local plan, and if the local plan doesn't demand any housing in your neighbourhood, then you can have a neighbourhood plan that has no housing in it. Is this what they decided? Not at all. They sat down, they thought about it, they thought about their children, their grandchildren, the needs of people to work in the place, and they have put additional housing. But, of course, not something that's come from Mars upon them, but housing of a kind and in places that actually have to do with the character and nature of St Abbas. I don't know anybody in the room knows St Abbas is one of the most beautiful villages in Britain. It's, you know, talk about beauty, that's beautiful. And they wanted to go on being beautiful. In fact, if you ask people in St Abbas how much they care about whether St Abbas is beautiful, you'd be lucky to escape with your life if you suggested they didn't. But they wanted more housing. Now this, a few years ago, we were being told is impossible. It's impossible that the citizens of St Abbas would actually want to do this. Take you to another village in my constituency, in Buckland Newton. This is years and years ago, before, it was one of the things that gave rise to the idea of neighbourhood planning. When I was a new MP, I was sitting in my surgery in Buckland Newton, and practically the whole village came in. They're not meant to, you know, it's meant to be one or two people coming with their problems. And so suddenly this sort of vast horde arrived on the scene, demanded to talk to me. Well, actually just shouted at me. And what they wanted to say was, we don't want the extra housing that is being forced upon us. And I thought, well, this is a terrible situation. It's quite clear, because as it happened, I'd been to the school, it's quite clear that this is a place where there are young families who are underhoused. They need more housing. They hate the housing. Well, after a little while, we got to the point where they created a community land trust. And so even before neighbourhood planning, they were able to control it. I have never, it's now, they're there, the houses in the community land trust are there. They're for local people, they're consistent with the character of the village, they're the sort of things they wanted to see. I have literally never had a single complaint about them. So that, you know, those two examples, but you can, Nick Bowles will take you through, you know, dozens and dozens developing around the country, and send a tribute to Policy Exchange that it's helped this on its way. You know, neighbourhood planning and control by local people can change the paradigm so that you really get out of this let's set up the machine gun nest and stop the housing, and you don't have to resort to mandation. You actually create circumstances in which people believe in the sensible way forward, and that's because they can control the look and shape.
Well, we're out of time, I believe, and it's traditional, I think, for me to elaborately weave together everything you've said in a neat summary. But it's more traditional that everyone just gives Oliver, and he shows their gratitude by giving him a round of applause. So let's sit straight.